very warm welcome to our webinar on International HRM. And it's great to see so many familiar names in the attendance list and in the list of registrations. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this seminar today. My name is Marianne Festing, and I'm a professor of human resource management and intercultural leadership at ESCP in Berlin. This event, as you know, is part of our IHRM webinar series, and we initiated that during the COVID-19 pandemic when we had to realize that we could not do our IHRM conference in Paris. And since then, we have continued our webinar series, and we now started the 6th year. And this is our 39th webinar. And we, of course, are very proud that we could go on with great speakers and contribute great knowledge to the field of IHRM with our webinar series. As you know, our webinars are recorded, and you will find today's webinar very soon on our YouTube channel, for which you can also register. If I speak about we, it's a great pleasure to be part of a great team composed of Mila Lazarova from the Center for Global Workforce Strategy at Simon Fraser University, Elaine Farndale and Cara Adrian from the Center of International HRM Studies at Penn State University, Miguel Olivas Lujan from Penn West University, and my colleague Maral Muratbekova-Touran from the Paris campus of ESCP Business School. So now let's come to today's speaker. It's a great pleasure to welcome our colleague Jelena Zikic. Jelena is professor at York University, professor of human resource management, and her research focuses on career transitions and challenges of diverse populations. So she has looked at migrants, baby boomers, remote workers, unemployed expats, and others. And in her work, she seeks to bridge microtype phenomena such as professional identity with more macro organizational processes, and she has looked at remote work, at integration, and so on. Dr. Zikic has significant international background, cross-cultural research collaborations, and varied teaching experiences a bit all over the world. And her work has been recognized by several research awards and has appeared in top-ranked journals in her field, such as Academy of Management Discoveries, Journal of Organizational Behavior, and so on. So today, Professor Jelena Zikic will speak about the career transition paradox. She will explore how contemporary careers promise freedom and growth, yet often generate instability and identity strain. So she will give a lot of examples from her research. And Jelena, we are very proud to have you here today, and we look very much forward to listening to you and are very happy to have so many guests in the audience for this great topic. If during the course of this presentation, you, our audience, should have any questions to our speakers, please put them in the Q&A, and we will consider them, of course, for the final discussion, which should be around 15 minutes, right? So, Jelena, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Marianne, first of all, for the invitation and for the introduction. I'm really glad to be part of this truly international community and this series of webinars that you've been having for quite some time now. I'm glad to share part of my work with you today, and I welcome questions, comments at the end in the last part of the webinar. It's especially nice for me to be here with all of you today virtually, because some of you may know I'm connecting from Toronto, where we have minus 24 degrees Celsius, and we had a huge snowstorm. So we're all inside, and this is really nice to have audience and to have ability to chat even virtually with all of you from around the world. So the topic, as Marianne mentioned, has to do with my work on career transitions, and in particular this idea of paradox or paradoxes that are involved in various types of transitions that I've studied. For those of you who maybe don't know about my trajectory, I'll just very briefly go over what I've been doing in the past up to today, just to put sort of things into perspective as to where I will focus on today. So this passion and curiosity for research started for me with looking at job loss and unemployment, which is a major career transition, a difficult one, as part of my dissertation, in fact. And I did both qualitative and quantitative study, and I became really interested in how people cope with transitions. Sometime later on, I started studying a group of career actors that are particularly interesting and important in many economies. They're skilled migrants who make major transitions in terms of their life and career. And I'm particularly interested in their professional identity struggle, and that's something I'll touch on today from some of my earlier work. And then I became more curious, obviously, as a scholar in the field of human resource management, what happens inside of the organization? How do these people integrate? What's the role of employers? And so I'll also touch on that briefly. And finally, I am coming back to my roots in terms of career studies broadly. Most recently in my work, I became really interested in these tensions and contradictions that I find in a lot of qualitative interviews that I'm doing. So I'm mostly focusing on qualitative work for quite a while. And that really fits with some of the research questions that I've been asking. So and I'll finish today's talk by talking about, by describing a little bit of very current research on a population called digital nomads, but I'll get to that later. So from transitions to paradox, this photograph is taken in a paradox museum in Stockholm, actually 2 months ago. And it's interesting that they call this Paradox Museum, and in many other countries, very similar exhibitions are called Museum of Illusions. And so I just want to start by having you think about, are paradoxes illusions? Are they real? And why is it that we call them both paradox and illusion? And I'd like to start by thinking about paradoxes broadly, so not just in management studies. But first of all, the definition. Contrary. So what is a paradox? It is a contrary yet interrelated set of elements that exist simultaneously and persist over time. So it's important to kind of keep this in mind, that there is a contradiction, yet these elements are interrelated and persist over time. The question that's guiding my presentation today is how individuals experience and react to career-related paradox or some type of simultaneous presence of contradiction in their work lives. So we're really focusing on the experience of career-related or work-related paradox. So as I said, what about paradox in general? Where do we see them? We see them a lot in the music that we listen to, maybe. Mozart and Beethoven are very well known for linking harmony and discord in their compositions. If we think about art, Picasso, Van Gogh often put contradictory elements, sort of juxtapose complexity in terms of our perceptions. We see light and dark, movement and stillness all together. Going closer to us, to books in management. Maybe some of you are familiar with Adam Grant's work on Think Again, The Power of Knowing What We Don't Know, and the famous book Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less. So these paradoxical questions have captured our attention because they are, in fact, very interesting. Coming down to us, I am pretty sure that many of you in the audience today can identify with some type of belongingness paradox, and maybe it is belonging to two countries, two cultures. For me, it's that constant push and pull, having lived for quite some time in Europe and Canada, and there's that paradox of belongingness. So I'm sure a lot of you can identify these kind of contrary yet interrelated elements. Now, what do we feel when we experience paradox? Typically, as humans, we strive for consistency in our cognitions. However, paradoxes do the opposite. They create inconsistency, they create some type of discomfort. Often, it can even be sort of like anxiety, ambiguity, frustrations. So the question is, how do we react to these tensions, and do we deal with them in constructive or destructive ways? How do we respond to them? When I started becoming interested in this topic, I really wanted to understand, obviously, as a researcher, what do we know when it comes to careers literature in particular, and work, international work, etc. So individual level paradox, interestingly, hasn't actually been studied as much. And for example, the first paper listed on this slide is 2001, The Paradox of Contemporary Career Management. Some other work has been done around paradoxical effects of intersectional invisibility, for example, when we talk about diversity, paradox of promise, career narratives, and then a recent piece on paradox of career identity. There is one paper here listed on the skill paradox, which is in fact related to skilled migrants, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I guess what I really wanted to show you with this list of articles is that in a lot of cases, even just by looking at the titles, paradox is used as a label. So, we're researching certain phenomena and we discover some kind of tension, inconsistency, and we label it as a paradox. This is a very different way of studying, a more sort of superficial way of understanding paradox, versus if we look at, if you use paradox as a lens through which we try to understand phenomena, where we go deeper into why these contradictions exist and how people cope with them. And I'm hoping to show you some of those examples through some of my work. So using it more as a lens. Now, how do we research this topic? And one of the things that you may realize as I'm talking about paradox is that it's often hard to study through our kind of logical, rational methodologies. They may sometimes oversimplify paradox and kind of over rationalize this phenomena. And so what I find really helpful when we think about tensions and contradictions and how to study them is to apply qualitative methodology and to understand them at that level through this kind of engagement with narratives. So this brings me to kind of these three stories that I want to tell you today. First two stories have to do with skilled migrants and the work that I've been doing for quite some time now. And I will start by talking a little bit about migrants as outsiders in terms of being outside of organizations, trying to cope with some of the labor market challenges, and this particular underemployment or also skill paradox. And then I'll touch on migrants as insiders and some of the recent work where we looked at what happens inside of organizations and this idea of integration paradox as well. And then I'll end the presentation moving to a very different topic, but still a type of a global worker, namely digital nomad careers. And we'll look at some of the examples of paradoxes that are coming up in their careers, but also in each of these cases, I'll touch on coping strategies and how these people are dealing with the paradox. And you'll see some different ways of dealing with it. Before I go into the migrant stories, I just wanted to highlight that paradoxes actually exist in general in contemporary career context. And one of the classic ones has to do with, what organizations expect from career actors today. So organizations in the past had this more traditional paternalistic attitude of help us, come work for us to help yourself. We'll give you something in return in a way. And it was usually more of a relational contract where people would stay longer, and there's benefits on both sides. More and more often, we see this sort of what we call employability loyalty paradox, where organizations are commonly adopting minimal responsibility for career management of the employees. It's more of a transactional contract. So help us, come work for us, but help yourself. And so this leads to this kind of tension between employees needing to do a lot of career self-management and look after themselves, yet employers still expecting loyalty, commitment, and 100% dedication. Similarly, in the careers literature, we talk a lot about boundaryless careers and possibilities to move between roles, between sectors, organizations. Yet, when a career actor enacts a very boundaryless career, we often encounter challenges because not all employers are appreciating that kind of meandering and going around different jobs. Same thing with progression paradox, where we develop skills in a new area, but employers actually prefer continuous prior experience. So just keeping in mind the fact that contemporary careers in general involve a lot of these tensions. Now, turning towards the skilled migrant population that I studied for a while now, what we call immigrant career paradox has to do with skills and education and kind of credentials that are coming into the local economy, but are devalued. And what's really interesting with many countries is that we have a human capital model of migration still, which means that we very much welcome skilled migrants to help the local economy fill in the vacancies. They already come with skills and experience. However, the more migrants bring, the higher skills, qualifications, the less they're likely to find employment relative to their local counterpart. So this is obviously a lot of tension and a lot of contradiction. Yes, come in, we want your skills, but you're going to be often working in survival job or just downgraded. And so foreign degrees and work experience is really unfairly devaluated in the hiring process, but also inside of the organization. So this doesn't stop at the point of labor market entry and entry into the organizations. There's also the threat-based skill paradox, where locals may feel threatened as insiders by these highly skilled individuals that are coming in. So even if you're employed and your skills are recognized, you're still often devaluated inside the organization and experience different challenges. So let me show you a little bit of data from qualitative research and how this plays out. So for quite some time, I've been really interested in medical professionals, doctors, and other types of medical professionals who come to Canada and have a lot of challenges. So this is one of the highly regulated occupations where credentials are not recognized. And so doctors are asked to go through various barriers and challenges, and often they never enter the local system. So in this particular study, we wanted to compare this kind of what we call extreme case examples. We really wanted to see, we know doctors have trouble, a lot of challenges. What about IT professionals? We know that, it's very easy after a few months of landing to Canada, you may be hired as an IT professional. And so credentials are obviously recognized. But even in that case, sometimes IT professionals don't always start at the same level where they were in their home country. So it's what we call extreme case comparison, this particular study. And then we follow this up in a couple of different studies, and I'll talk about those as well. But let's see what these doctors felt in terms of their tension and their paradox. So this is Robin, who told us, I felt confident that if I passed all the exams, there would be no barrier to get into residency. But after coming here, yes, I didn't get the real picture. I passed all the exams with pretty good scores. Scores are excellent, but I'm still here. I'm still an international medical graduate. And the main thing is they don't believe us. So what this individual is saying is that really I've done everything I could. And so the tension is in I've gone through these exams, I still can't practice. And the local medical profession don't believe us. So this is a little bit of helplessness as well on the part of the doctors, but this is the reality of what they face. No matter what they do, it's very hard for them to enter. And here's an example of somebody who's really struggled in terms of her professional identity. This is Mirza. I've interviewed her in a local hospital. She is a surgeon from India, and she was basically doing filing for a local surgeon. So what she told us, if I said that I'm a fish out of water, so I was a physician back home, I can serve people and I can help. Here, I'm nothing, just a person who came from India to this country. And so basically, Mirza has completely erased her professional identity. Sam, on the other hand, says that I volunteered at different clinics. I learned many things, the working techniques here. Everything was good, but I can't do anything. I know all the techniques. Patients are the same, but I'm not allowed to practice. This was hurting. I can't do anything. So again, he's done what it takes. He knows the job. He has the skills, yet he can't practice. And you may be asking what happens? How do they resolve this? So here is Tamara, and this is just one identity tactic. There are others in this particular study, but what Tamara did is something called, we identified as identity customization. So yes, she downgraded her status as a doctor. She's not a doctor, but this is what she says. I personally like the hospital. You're back, like a fish in the water again. Took me a long time to get here, long time. And basically, she is ultrasound technician. She's practicing something. She is communicating, connecting to local professionals, doctors. And unlike Mirza, she says, I am fish in the water again. So some part of her identity has been reconnected by being back in the hospital. So this coping with devaluation clearly in Tamara's case led to sacrifice, led to giving up her full status as a professional. This idea of career sacrifice is actually something I've started studying during the pandemic, where I was realizing how much people are losing and giving up in some cases to adapt to the context. So migrants are coping with the paradox often by this idea of through loss, consciously giving up on something valuable to achieve potentially another valuable goal, potentially in the future, right? And so there's this trade-off and give and take that happens in the careers of migrants and in their coping, in terms of their coping mechanism. In the paradox literature, this is often referred to as either or, so they take one or the other side of the tension, or versus both and paradox solution, which, as I will explain later, is a more ideal, more positive way if we can integrate the two sides of the paradox. But in the case of migrants, it was often the loss and the giving up of one side, that professional identity in this case. So to conclude around doctors in this particular set of studies, we found what's called in sociology actually occupational closure, where local medical profession is creating this low supply, high demand situation. Obviously, we can talk about, what happens in Canadian local medical profession and why are these challenges, but that's probably not the topic for today in so much detail. What I wanted to show you is this idea of sacrificing career goals for family, perhaps, well-being, being away from some other uncertain situation, maybe in their home country. But we wanted to continue. We wanted to understand how these people feel further on when they actually enter some jobs or something that we define as alternative career options. And so this study, actually a recent study published in 2024, is looking at individuals, medical professionals, different type, not just doctors, and looking at the pathways, looking at what are they doing at the moment, how are they managing in terms of their professional identity, how are they making meaning. And I chose especially these two pathways to touch on: the provisional and experimental. And I'll tell you what the provisional pathway was. What we found is that some of these individuals enter these alternative roles, alternative careers, but really saw them only in terms of like utilitarian motivation. I only need it now. I need it to survive until my real preferred career option is possible, right? So they were very much defending their professional identity and refusing to understand that they need to do something else, at least for the time being, or to learn from that role. Experimental pathway, on the other hand, as you will see from the quotes, shows individuals who are accepting both sides of the tension. So yes, I can't be myself. I can't really be a doctor, dentist, and so on. But, I'm not there yet. I am still moving. I'm still learning. I'm exploring options. I'm really experimenting with this alternative career. And so here is the first one, the provisional alternative career pathway, where the individuals are experiencing tension between needing a job or dealing with a survival job in some cases, but sometimes it wasn't just survival job. It was, some type of a role that was often within a medical profession or similar. So their tension is between that job and getting back to becoming a doctor in this case. So Rani said to us, I don't want to identify with this work, the alternative career. It's not who I am. It's not a reflection of my knowledge, skill, ability, intellectual capability, or anything. I never say that I do this. I do it to survive. And for the time being, my future goal is to become a doctor again. That is what I want to do. This is how I see myself. So as you can see in Rani's quote, he's very much focusing only on one side of this issue. And, he wants to become a doctor again. He does not even share what he does with the external world, with people around him. Comparing this, or rather contrasting Rani's attitude towards tension to what Ryan said to us. Ryan says, the job, okay, alternative career, is temporary. I believe that I will not be in the same position for unduly long time, but this offers me a good exposure to the Canadian public health system, even if from the periphery. So that's an area I saw as an opportunity. And I was like, okay, this makes sense. So it's an important role to be in, always learning process, which fulfills me. Ryan is able to play with both sides, right? He's able to leverage a little bit on the paradox situation, as in gaining new skills. So what we're starting to see is the fact that some people are able to capitalize on paradox, utilizing these tensions to their advantage versus resolving them, ignoring them, going to the one side only. Before I tell you about what we find inside of the organizations, I just wanted to touch on a very different study, yet with some other types of contradictions and paradoxes. And that is one study where we looked at space and how migrants adapt and settle in terms of actually physical space in which they navigate. So in this case, it was different cities where they immigrated, where they settled. And in this study, which is really about this career recontextualization, we find that they simultaneously negotiate spatial continuity and spatial discontinuity. What I mean by that is spatial continuity is memories of the home city, how things worked back home, physical environment I'm talking about, versus experiencing this deep unfamiliarity and almost like being lost, being dislocated in this new city where I'm now navigating. So they said things like Toronto streets felt like boxes, sort of like something familiar, familiar enough to navigate, yet emotionally completely foreign. So on the one hand, yes, there's continuity, but it is completely foreign. I was feeling like a stranger. This belongs to me now. Over time, this person said, this belongs to me now. So, as I said, we are seeing this spatial, interesting paradox of continuity and discontinuity at the same time as they need to adapt and integrate. And one of the things we used in this study was boundary object theory. And these boundary objects in the city really were designed to both integrate them, but also exclude them or marginalize them at the same time. Anyway, there's more to this study, but in the interest of time, I just want to give you a little snapshot of what we're seeing when migrants enter local organizations. So one of the things that I started doing earlier in my career is looking theoretically, how can we understand this entry into the organization, but also how do organizations gain competitive advantage? And so I had this paper in International IHRM Journal quite some time ago where I realized that comparing career trajectory and using intelligent career theory with resource-based view from strategic HR really made sense to understand both sides, kind of the individual career challenges and what organizations want, need, etc. But what I found over time is that this knowing why, which comes from intelligent career theory, is the motivation. At the organizational level, it's the motivation to attract skilled migrant diversity. We know quite a bit about that. We also know a lot about organizational knowing how in terms of attracting and managing entry. But we know a lot less about the insider situation. And there are studies coming more and more on the integration and development and these connections and relationships between foreigners and locals, but less is known and more challenges are in this area. And so with colleagues, I think some of them may be on this call as well, we did a study in a very unique context. We studied people in Luxembourg, which is a highly international yet very small labor market. And we interviewed non-EU skilled migrants. Obviously, they have different challenges versus EU workers. They're a minority as well. And we really wanted to see those who had jobs, right? We were focusing on what happens inside of the organization. So we looked at IT, management, finance, and science. And we found, again, fitting in was a challenge. People were saying, you feel you don't belong to any group. But remember, they had jobs in their, at their level. They also felt career mismatch. I was hired as a manager, but they made me a specialist. So they felt a lot of these job promises that were not met in terms of title and status. And for fitting in, there was a lot of communication challenges around communication norms in local organizations, cultural expectations, and so on. And in the same paper, we sort of found these three typologies, three groups of career actors, these non-EU migrants. We found that some adapted and coped with their challenges, as we call them workhorses. They over-delivered. They kept learning, showing up, right? I'm always available. I stay late. And this was their way to try and integrate. Career rebels, quite on the contrary, as the name says, they really wanted to change things. They sometimes saw things that were outdated, that could be done better. They wanted to bring new ideas. I couldn't just follow instructions blindly. And the third group had to do with career conformists, which adapted quietly. They prioritized stability and well-being and did not want to make trouble. I accept reality and I find the positive side. So as you can see, even in cases where individuals were able to enter local organizations and have jobs similar to what they did, they still had challenges. So this brings me to this paradox of inclusion where we see skilled migrants entering, being structurally included, but what I call being relationally excluded. And so in this sense, integration is really not about selecting the right people, bringing them on board. As I said, that, the first part of that figure around why are we bringing migrants? How can we attract them and bring them? I mean, that's not a challenge. It is really about relationships and organizational context. So hiring skilled migrants, we can invest in that. But what seems to be really neglected is the social and relational infrastructure of integration. And so I started kind of asking questions about communication and coordination of tasks. And so at the more micro level, how do these people work together? This is something that I'm still looking into. We're interviewing. Actually, we're writing up a paper on small and medium employers and specifically HR sort of professionals, but also founders of small and medium employers. And we're asking these questions around integration, communication, and coordination. But I wanted to show you a theoretical, conceptual piece, just briefly a model around these issues. And that has to do with this, what I called relational communication climate. And this is precisely something that will help organizations to integrate better. So it will lead to more relational coordination and all these great outcomes that are on the right side. But just briefly, what do I mean by relational communication climate, or RCC? That is something that has to do with shared communication environment. It has to do with everyday interactions, which involve open dialogue, mutual understanding, and high quality connections. Now, this can be done. It is not really about formal diversity policies. It is much more about that everyday communication strategy that is implemented and that organization is trying to create as part of their fabric, as part of their culture, climate, etc. And it has two main principles, in my view. One has to do with perspective taking and seeing from other viewpoints to build empathy and reduce bias, and standpoint plurality, which is really valuing diverse, marginalized perspectives in order to strengthen collaboration. And so this kind of ends the conversation or my stories around migrants. We've seen them in the labor market, their struggles, their coping, and a little bit what happens inside of the organizations and some avenue for future work, which has to do with communication. So shifting gears, switching for the last 10 minutes of my talk to tell you a bit about digital nomads and their potentially disconnection paradox. So when we think about digital nomads, this particular group of people has really, the population of digital nomads has grown post-pandemic and during pandemic. As you can imagine, we all learned to work in different ways. So they represent in some ways the extreme end of new career phenomena. And their really approach to careers is characterized by location flexibility with a lot of agency. They actively choose their locations. And most importantly, they wouldn't be able to do this type of lifestyle if it wasn't for digital technologies. So they really seek to integrate work and life and personal values. Let me give you like a very concrete definition by Cook. He says a digital nomad is an individual who uses digital technologies to work remotely while intentionally pursuing location-independent mobile lifestyle. So there's really decoupling of work and place. There is autonomy, but also self-regulation and self-direction. You can already see there's a lot of tension here. Tension between freedom and self-discipline, leisure and productivity, And Cook calls this discipline of freedom, which is basically this ability to still be productive while engaging in this type of lifestyle. This is not a vacation. And some people, have these images of digital nomads, on the beach, not to mention that beach is the worst place to work on your laptop. But they have no permanent residence, okay? And the digital nomadism is really seen as a social and identity phenomena, not just a work arrangement. So in these kind of studies on digital nomads, we focus on this intersection between work, lifestyle, autonomy, and meaning. And I'll just tell you a bit about a study we did recently with my colleagues. We looked at Reddit data. So we looked at this textual data, their social media posts between 2010 and 2023. So we had a lot of data. And one of my co-authors, expert on probabilistic topic modeling, was helping us and guiding us through understanding these narratives. This is just first kind of attempt for me to understand digital nomads, and there's a series of projects that are ongoing at the moment. In fact, this and last week I was interviewing some nomads over Zoom. And we're really continuing to look at these interesting work routines and social context and learn about different phenomena that I'll tell you about in a second. So here are two digital nomads and their quotes, and the one in blue talks about, growing rootless, working remotely as long as I can. Nomadic life is important to me, but I also highly value relationships. You see already that tension around social connection. And this individual said, I fell in love with someone who doesn't have a clear path to remote work. They're resident in a city. I've spent a lot of time there in the last 2 years. So at some point, social relationship partnerships may become a challenge for this particular group. But definitely they still, in the beginning of this quote, he says, I'll be working remote as long as I can. There's a lot of tension there. The other one in the orange talks about switching to 12, 24-month window. What this means is that typically digital nomads are defined by traveling and moving every 2 to 3 months and having 3 to 4 locations per year. So here she's saying, look, I can even stay longer in one location, but that's barely enough time to make any real friends. A big part for me is that being a digital nomad is basically living nearly friendless in the real world. And you do have friends, but they're temporary. So this notion of what a friend is changing. It's, friends are temporary. Moving on into a topic that I'm starting to learn about, and I'm really interested in understanding loneliness at work. And that was one of the reasons why we thought digital nomads would be a really good starting place for studying loneliness. In the first part of this quote, digital nomad told us, or wrote rather, because this is from social media, while I feel self-healing during travel, I found it to be both good and bad. In large, I'd say, for me at least, it's great. Although that doesn't come with a lot of testing and anxious times, travel anxiety or travel excitement, completely dependent on you. So in these few lines, you see good and bad, travel anxiety, travel excitement, full of tensions, full of contradictions and paradoxes. And the second one, the loneliness has come to extreme. In the past 5 years, I've never had this feeling. Now it's weird. I feel old, tired of visa applications, choosing a place to go next, suddenly the need of having a serious relationship. Again, similarly to the earlier quote, there is some aspect of burnout here with constant travel. As you can imagine, we as academics travel a lot. It's tiring, but imagine what these lives are like. And finally, I bring you to some solution to how these people cope. This is a really interesting one about home because they have no permanent address. My concept of home has changed. I do have a home. It's just very different from what others think as one. I've used to view it. Mine is no longer limited by location or possession. No single item or even the collection of items is my home. Rather, it's my mindset. And I just added something that happened literally a few days ago in an interview. Another digital nomad said to me, "Every place is home. We take our home with us. My home is the dot." The dot, he's referring to the Earth, the planet. I have no fixed address. And we take our home with us. He had like a mobile home. He lived in a trailer, etc. He's done it all. Currently, he's on a boat, and that's where the interview took place. But I want to point out to this idea of mindset. Okay, rather, it's my mindset. This leads me to one solution to paradox, especially in management literature, which is a paradox mindset. This is an orientation towards embracing contradictions. So it's like an individual disposition to cognitively perceive, both paradoxical poles as truth, both of them. And it should be considered and simultaneously over time. So rather than choosing the either or, paradox mindset encourages us to really think in the both and ways. This leads to more innovative, creative ideas, and accepting tension actually reduces stress. Paradox mindset is based on the yin-yang philosophy, where we view world as more holistic, dynamic, and we know that it's always shaped by integration of opposites. These opposites are interrelated but complementary. And so if we choose between tensions, we're really failing to capture the essence of paradoxes. So the ideas that I try to present to you really went from some of the individuals that I interviewed, that I study, who had to sacrifice, to those who are able to change the mindset. So one of the messages that I find in kind of this work is that nurturing this paradox mindset suggests an alternative perspective, accepting and learning to live with the tension associated with competing demands. It's an understanding that competing demands are not resolvable and they cannot be eliminated. In this sense, I am really seeing a lot of this come up with digital nomads, and these are just some themes, some tensions that they are trying to work with on both sides. As an example, technology as an enabler versus something that creates challenges, productivity and leisure, constantly trying to integrate that. Location, frequent relocation versus stability of work routines. This idea that we think they have glorious lifestyle and sometimes they're merely surviving. And in some of the work, we're really interested in this belongingness to a community. Sometimes they belong to a community of digital nomads, but also they're really outsiders. Social connection is the main one, whether they're giving or receiving connection. Do they have the need for it? How do they manage it? Relying on some of the work, earlier work on high quality connection, social exchange theory, and so on. So future directions of work with paradox, I'm really interested in understanding how these contradictions and tensions, this tug of war sentiment can actually energize individuals to cope better. For my population of migrants, sometimes we feel that structural barriers and pressures are often too powerful, and perhaps mindset may not be enough in some cases, but it is definitely a helpful way to think about, like the experimental pathway that I showed you earlier. I would really like to focus more on context. That's been one of my interests for a while, understanding digital nomads in terms of these contextual specific characteristics and role of others, as well as individual resources. And so one of the topics that I'm looking at is extreme remote work and loneliness. And by the way, there's also dark side of paradoxes. There's some people who are looking at, obviously the dark side, which we've seen quite a bit with migrants. So, one final message is I think we should, if you're interested in looking at tensions in your own work, using it more than a label, not just identifying it, highlighting it, but really using it as a tool, as a lens to understand surprising findings or contradictions, especially in my case, in terms of these paradoxical nature of careers. So, paradoxes can be opportunities rather than threats. And this is a final quote I wanted to leave you with. I have a carry-on size bag. I move locations very regularly. The location itself isn't my home. I've exchanged every item I carry with me a couple of times. None of my possessions are my home. Yet I still feel comfort and familiarity when I settle into a new location. Can be possibly the place that feels familiar, nor any of my possessions especially comforting. Yet once I settle in, my mindset about the place changes. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jelena. I'm still impressed about how you could present this great research in such a short time. So thank you very much. And we have some questions in the Q&A. But I would like to highlight what you have emphasized, right? On the one side, we could look more into paradox theory and what we can learn from that for international HRM. On the other side, you presented your results on the migrants, on the digital nomads, so on different types of global employees. So this could also be an avenue to look at, right? So before I ask my own questions, I would like to reflect a little bit with you what is in the chat. And the first statement was by your co-author, Vlad Weyman. I think I can mention your name, Vlad. So he was making the link to macro talent management, right? Especially in the case of Canada. And I think we can see the same developments in other countries, right? And in your presentation, you were also talking about structure, about the structural context. So if for a little moment we can concentrate on migrants and on, let's say, the macro environment, what would be lessons learned from your studies? I think it's very rich what you presented. So how would you answer that question?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question for me because I'm a psychologist and I really focus on the individual, but I force
Mm.
myself also to think in macro terms, and I teach strategic HR, so it really gets me to think beyond the individual. So one of the things we find is this occupational closure, right, with doctors. And so this has to do with the local medical society, with the local medical profession, with public health care. So there are a lot of these structural issues at the level of society, but also at the level of individual occupation. And it may work very differently at the macro level when we think about lawyers, architects, engineers, who still face closure to some extent, but perhaps not as harsh barriers as with the medical profession. It obviously has also to do with the resources that, doctors have. And so this way of protecting the local is a theme that I'm seeing in different economies. It's not just a Canadian story, but there's
Yeah.
really this threat
Yeah.
that we're feeling inside the organizations when it comes to integrating migrants as well. So I'd say, structural, but depending on the occupation, but internally it comes to, discrimination and so on, and the fear of somebody who's got skills, who has experience, and so on.
Mm. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm answering Vlad's question. I don't know
Yeah,
if
but
Vlad's asking on solutions or.
We will not have a complete answer, right? It's
Yeah.
just your reflection and your thoughts at the moment. I have another rather complex question, and I just read it out, and maybe you can make sense out of that. So, in your research, do you see any relationship between which coping strategies inside the organization is most related to being perceived as a threat in host context? If I can make sense out of that, and I had to think about it a minute, is okay, what kind of coping strategies do we have inside the organization that are related to being perceived as a threat in host country environments? So, is there
Yeah.
anything which you could mention here?
I wonder if the question is relating to the study that we did in Luxembourg, where we looked at
Mhm.
these strategies. And I would say out of those three types, it's the middle one, the career rebels.
Mm,
When you're new, when you're a foreigner, and you're trying to change things around here, it's probably the hardest way to go about integration. So
mm. Yeah, yeah.
I
It's a
think,
very interesting thought. And
yeah,
maybe we can turn to how do we cope with paradoxes? So, um, to what extent do you think that this paradox mindset is something that, and maybe I can enlarge the discussion, that all global employees would need to cope with these ambiguous situations they encounter in their everyday international life? So is it now that we talk about a global paradox mindset or something like
yeah,
that?
yeah. It's an interesting question, Marianne. How there are a lot of tensions in terms of global workers, not just skilled migrants. I guess that's what you're referring to. And
Mhm.
I see this paradox mindset, as much as I kind of try to understand and read about it, as something that is helpful in many situations. And so it would definitely apply to tensions experienced by global workers in
Mm,
general. It's more an outlook at, how you view tension and how you are, and whether you're able to join these two opposites cognitively.
mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So for sure, a path we can continue on. And
Yes, yes, I think it's a really interesting avenue for future work, especially
yeah,
in disentangling kind of
yeah,
when is it that people are able to
yeah,
leverage on paradox mindset, or when is it not possible?
yeah,
And are there
yeah.
these individual dispositions that can potentially be enhanced or trained or developed?
Mm, mm. I have another question, which is concerned with faculty with foreign, let's say, doctoral degrees. If you put that in the context of migration, right? One person would like to know how you see that in the context of academia in the US, but
Mhm.
I think it's more than the US, right? It's a broader question. So,
Yeah,
what
yes,
does
yes,
it
yes.
mean in terms of migration to come with this foreign doctoral degrees into another context? Have you analyzed that as well, or would you have any insights? How would you see that?
We've done one study with looking at academic careers quite some time ago. But I moved between
Yeah.
continents and kind of carried my academic career with me. I would say that academic community is a unique one, in a sense that our tenure systems and our, um, indicators of success are often internationally accepted and validated in many different countries. Now, there are obviously internal organizational cultures of any university that may treat international academics differently. And I wouldn't say that we don't have challenges being international academics. And despite this extreme mobility of academic careers, there are still challenges.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think it could be also a topic for future research, right? To analyze the current situation, maybe also have a longitudinal view on that, how that has changed. So I think
And
that,
paradoxes
yes,
of
yeah,
academic careers.
yeah,
There are
exactly.
many.
Exactly. So we are already at the end of our time, Jelena. It was so interesting listening to you. And thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge with us. I now have to announce a few things, and our audience will see that in our chat. So there's still time to submit to the 7th Global Conference on International HRM, which will take place in Cyprus end of May. So if you would like to be there, hurry up and submit your work. There is another workshop on strategic human resource management I would like to introduce. This is in Cagliari in Sardinia, Italy, in March. So if you're interested in that research field, that would be interesting for you. And of course, we will continue our international webinar series. So on March 9, we have a presentation by Tomoki Sekiguchi, and he will talk on international human resource management and global talent management in Asia. If you're interested, and I'm sure you are, please register March 9, put it into your calendars. And for today, we thank you very much for participating in our International HRM webinar. Thank you and bye-bye.